I stood there in the hospital hallway, clutching my phone so tightly that my knuckles turned pale. Everything around me seemed like a blur, distant and muffled, as though the world had faded into the background. The only sound I could focus on was the rapid thumping of my heart, erratic and loud, drowning out all rational thoughts. I had been there for hours, waiting and hoping, holding on to the fragile hope that something might change. But as time dragged on, that hope felt like it was slipping away, unraveling with every passing minute. The door in front of me creaked open, and Ruby, the nurse who had been looking after the patient, stepped out. Her calm, quiet presence was a stark contrast to the storm raging inside me. She had her dark hair pulled back neatly, and when our eyes met, there was a gentle sympathy there that both comforted and unsettled me. "It's going to be okay," she said softly. Her voice was steady and soothing, but it felt so out of place compared to the turmoil churning inside me. I wanted to believe her, to let those words sink in, but the panic inside me wouldn't let go. But still, I searched her face, hoping to find more, something that would reassure me. Yet, all I saw was the same composed expression, as if this was just another day for her. Was it? Could it really be so routine for her? I could barely bring myself to nod, feeling the weight of the moment pressing down on me, threatening to suffocate me right there. My gaze drifted toward the door she had just exited. My heart raced even faster. I had no way of knowing what was happening behind it, no idea what I might be walking into. But Ruby was standing there, telling me everything would be okay. In that moment, I had no choice but to trust her. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. It felt empty, mechanical, as if I were simply going through the motions, disconnected from what was happening. Ruby nodded, offering a small, patient smile that she had no doubt perfected over time. She began walking away, leaving me with my thoughts. Yet, something made her stop just a few steps away. "You can go in whenever you're ready," she said, her voice carrying a softness that unsettled me, as if she knew more than she was letting on, as though there was something she understood that I didn't. I nodded again, my throat tight, unable to speak. I watched her disappear down the hall, and the silence of the hospital felt even more oppressive, like the very walls were holding their breath. I was alone now, completely alone with whatever news awaited me behind that door. I took a deep breath, trying to summon the courage to face whatever was coming. The air was thick with the smell of disinfectant, and the buzz of the fluorescent lights overhead only added to the stillness. I glanced at the door one more time, my stomach twisting in knots, and took a step forward, but my legs wouldn't move. I felt frozen, like an invisible force was keeping me rooted to the spot. I couldn't go in. Not yet. Not until I knew what I was walking into. The thought of it was paralyzing. I closed my eyes and tried to steady my breathing. I told myself that Ruby wouldn't have lied to me. She had no reason to. She didn't know me, had no personal stake in this. If she said it would be okay, then maybe it would be. But why did it still feel like the ground was slipping out from under me? Time dragged on, each second stretching into eternity. I could hear faint sounds from down the hall, distant beeps from machines, the shuffle of footsteps, murmurs of conversation. But they all felt so far away, as if they belonged to another world. A world where life was normal, where people weren't standing in sterile hallways waiting for life-changing news. I couldn't stop thinking about Ruby's face, how her eyes had met mine, how calm and certain she'd been when she spoke. But there was something more to it, something in the way she paused before walking away. It was as if she wanted to say more but held back, or maybe I was just reading too much into it, desperate for any sign that could bring clarity. I glanced at the door again, and that wave of nausea came rushing back. I couldn't do this. I wasn't ready, but I also knew I couldn't stand there forever. Whatever was inside that room was waiting for me, and no amount of delaying would change the outcome. With a deep breath, I forced my legs to move one step, then another. My fingers trembled as I reached for the cold metal door handle. I took one last look down the hallway, almost expecting Ruby to appear again, to offer some final reassurance that everything would be fine. But she was gone, and I was all alone. I pushed the door open, my heart pounding, my mind spinning with endless possibilities. As I stepped into the room, I braced myself for whatever waited on the other side. Weeks had passed since that day at the hospital, but the feeling that something had shifted in my life never left me. Every moment since then seemed tied back to that sterile hallway, to the silence that followed Ruby's words. By chance, I ran into her again during a routine checkup. I had come in more out of habit than necessity, hoping that maybe I could convince myself that everything was fine. It was just a checkup after all, nothing more. I didn't expect to see her there. When she greeted me, it was with the same calm professionalism I remembered from before. Her presence immediately took me back to that hospital hallway, and for a moment, the tension in my chest returned. But today felt different. It wasn't just the routine or the clinical setting. There was an unspoken energy in the air, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. Ruby led me down the hallway toward one of the smaller examination rooms. Her footsteps, soft yet steady, echoed faintly through the narrow space. She opened the door and motioned for me to step inside. I perched on the edge of the exam table, watching Ruby as she moved around the room, her movements efficient and quiet. There was something about the way she worked, so focused, so controlled, that drew my attention. I couldn't help but watch her, just like I had the first time. Each motion seemed deliberate, almost rehearsed. I tried to redirect my thoughts, reminding myself that I was here for a routine checkup. Nothing more. But my focus kept drifting back to her. The way her hair fell perfectly around her face, the graceful fluidity of her hands as she worked. There was a quiet elegance in everything she did, and I couldn't help but be drawn to it. When Ruby turned toward me with the blood pressure cuff in hand, our eyes briefly locked. I felt it again, whatever it was between us, a spark, an unspoken connection, something that lingered in the air and felt heavier this time. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, her fingers brushing lightly against my skin. It was a small, innocuous touch, but it sent an unexpected shiver through me. I froze, not sure why it felt so different now. She must have sensed my hesitation because she gave me that same calm, practiced smile, though this time it seemed a little warmer, a little less distant. "Relax," Ruby said, her voice low and soothing. "It's just a quick check. You'll be out of here in no time." I nodded, trying to ignore the tightening in my chest, the way my heart seemed to skip a beat. As she inflated the cuff, I stared at the plain walls of the room, trying to steady my breathing, but all I could think about was how close she was standing, how every movement of hers seemed to make the air feel more charged, more intimate. Her hands moved with practiced ease, making the room feel smaller, as if the space between us was shrinking with every second. When she finished, she made a note on her clipboard. "Everything looks good," she said with a smile. "No issues. You're in good health." I exhaled, relieved, telling myself that it was just a checkup, just another routine. But there was still that feeling in my chest, a sense that something was different this time, even if I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Then she moved to take my temperature. Her proximity was closer than before, her body almost brushing against mine as she gently placed her hand on my shoulder to steady herself while she positioned the thermometer. The touch seemed innocent, even necessary, but it felt oddly charged, as if the air between us had thickened, making it hard to breathe. My pulse quickened, and I tried to tell myself it was nothing. The chill of the room, maybe, but it wasn't nothing. When Ruby was finished, she lingered for a second, her hand still resting on my shoulder. She looked at me then, her eyes studying mine, waiting. I couldn't bring myself to speak. My throat was tight, my mind racing, unsure of what to say, or even if I should say anything at all. The silence stretched out between us, thick and heavy. I felt like I was caught in some kind of moment, suspended in time, unsure of how to move. Then she broke it. "Is there anything else you need?" she asked, her voice softer, almost tentative. I swallowed, fighting the knot in my throat, and shook my head. "No, I'm fine." But I wasn't fine. I felt the air around me close in, the tension between us hanging like a cloud. I couldn't stop thinking about the way she'd touched me, the way she'd stayed just a moment longer than necessary, as if she didn't want to let go. I knew it was crossing a line, but I couldn't bring myself to pull back. Not yet. For a moment, Her smile faltered, just for the briefest second, and then she stepped back toward the door. But before she left, she turned back to me, her eyes meeting mine one last time. There was something in her gaze, something unspoken, and it made my heart skip. Curiosity, maybe? Interest. I couldn't name it, but I felt it sharp and sudden, and then, just as quickly as it had started, she was gone. I sat there, staring at the empty doorway, the silence pressing down on me. My heart was still racing, and my thoughts were scattered. I couldn't shake the feeling that something between us had changed, something that had been set in motion and couldn't be undone. When the door clicked shut, the weight of it all didn't lift. It stayed with me, deep inside, like a question I didn't know how to answer. After that day at the clinic, Ruby's presence lingered with me, like a shadow that wouldn't leave. It felt wrong, almost that I couldn't stop thinking about her, especially when I was home with my wife, trying to act like everything was fine. But nothing felt fine anymore. Not since the moment in that exam room when our eyes had locked and something had shifted between us. Days passed in a haze. Time stretched on, each moment feeling drawn out like elastic being pulled too tight, until I felt like it might snap. At home, I started to withdraw without even realizing it. My wife noticed the change right away. She'd ask little questions, the kind she always asked. How was your day? How's work? But my answers were empty. I was there physically, but my mind was somewhere else, replaying the brief moments with Ruby over and over, trying to make sense of them. I told myself it was nothing, a fleeting connection, a shared moment. It didn't mean anything. But the more I tried to push it away, the more it lingered, like a shadow in the corner of my mind. I had hoped the silence would help me move on, help me forget, but it only made everything feel heavier, like the things we hadn't said were pressing down on me. One night, after a particularly quiet dinner, my wife sat across from me, watching me closely. I could feel the tension between us, thick and suffocating, like she knew something was wrong but was waiting for me to admit it. Finally, she spoke. Her voice was soft, but there was a sharpness to it, like a knife cutting through the stillness. You've been distant, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. I looked down at my plate, guilt twisting in my stomach. I'm just stressed, I said, the words tasting bitter in my mouth. Stressed. She didn't buy it. Her eyes narrowed slightly as she leaned in, her elbows resting on the table. Is it work? Or is it something else? The implication was clear. She wasn't asking about work. She was asking about us, about what was happening between us. My pulse quickened, and for a moment, I felt like the walls were closing in. I thought about telling her everything, about Ruby, about the way I couldn't stop thinking about her, but the words wouldn't come. I couldn't bring myself to admit what had been happening in my mind, not even to myself. I'm just exhausted, I said, forcing a half-hearted smile. Everything's fine. But I could see the doubt in her eyes. It was in the way her expression tightened, the way she looked at me, as if she could see right through my forced calm. She didn't press me further that night, but the tension between us was palpable, hanging like a thread that could snap at any moment. The truth was I had no idea how to fix this, and part of me wasn't sure I even wanted to. My thoughts were consumed by Ruby, and it felt like something I couldn't shake. I didn't understand it, couldn't explain it, but the more I tried to move on, the stronger the pull became. Then came a message. I was working in my home office, sorting through emails when my phone buzzed. Expecting a work-related notification, I glanced down, but instead, I saw an unknown number. My heart jolted. I opened the message. Hey, it's Ruby. Can we talk? For a moment, I just stared at the screen. My mind raced. How did she get my number? I hadn't shared it with her, but then I realized she worked at the clinic. All my info was in their system. Of course, it would have been easy for her to find me. Still, seeing her name on my phone made my pulse spike. I paused before replying, my fingers hovering over the keys. What was I doing? I knew this wasn't safe ground, but I couldn't stop myself. Sure, I typed, my hands shaking. What's going on? She responded almost immediately. I've been thinking about you. Simple words, but they hit me like a sledgehammer. I stared at the screen, my mind spinning. I should have shut it all down. I should have erased the message and walked away. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I found myself typing, a swirl of guilt and curiosity coursing through me. I've been thinking about you too. As soon as I sent it, regret flooded me. What was I doing? My wife was in the other room, unaware of any of this. And here I was, exchanging flirtatious messages with someone else. But the temptation was too strong. It was like I had no control over it. Ruby and I exchanged a few more texts, the conversation charged with unspoken tension. We didn't address the elephant in the room, what had happened between us, but it was there, simmering under the surface of every message, every pause. Eventually, the messages tapered off, leaving me staring at my phone, feeling the weight of what had just transpired. I knew I had crossed the line, but it was too late. I couldn't unopen that door. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to focus on work, on my life at home, but the thought of Ruby never left my mind. Her messages, her words, they gnawed at me, a constant presence I couldn't shake. I knew I couldn't keep this up. It was only a matter of time before it all fell apart. But every time she reached out, I responded. I couldn't stop. It was like I was caught in a cycle, and no matter how much I tried to break free, I couldn't. One evening, after another quiet dinner with my wife, I found myself alone in my office, staring at my phone. Ruby hadn't messaged that day, and the silence felt like a weight pressing on me. Part of me was relieved, but another part missed the thrill of our secret conversations. It was dangerous, yes, but it was also exhilarating. As I was about to put my phone down, it buzzed with a new message. It was Ruby. We need to talk. My heart sank. I knew what that meant. We need to talk. I could feel the weight of those words in my chest, heavy and unavoidable. There was no mistaking the tone. This wasn't a casual check-in. It wasn't playful or light. It was serious. Ruby had something important to say, and I knew I couldn't ignore it. We had been dancing around the line for too long, and now it was time to face it. But I wasn't ready. I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the screen. What could I possibly say? Once I agreed to meet her, there would be no going back. I was already deep into something I couldn't control, and meeting her in person would push it over the edge. Still, a part of me, the part that couldn't stop thinking about her, was desperate to know what she had to say. After a long moment of hesitation, I typed back, "Where and when?" Her reply was swift. "Tomorrow night. The cafe near the park. 7 p.m. I didn't hesitate this time. "I'll be there." The next day was a blur. I went through my usual routine, work, small talk with my wife, chores around the house, but my mind was already at that cafe, running through every possible outcome. Would she want to end it? Tell me it was over? Or would she want something more? The closer it got to 7 p.m., the more my nerves got the better of me. I knew this wasn't going to end well, no matter what Ruby said. I had let myself get tangled in something I shouldn't have, and now I would have to face the consequences. I arrived at the cafe early, my thoughts racing. The place was quiet, with a few patrons scattered around, sipping coffee or staring into their phones. I found a table at the back, away from the windows, hoping to remain unnoticed. I tried to steady my breathing, but my chest was tight with anticipation. Ruby wasn't there yet, and the minutes dragged on. When she finally walked in, my heart skipped a beat. There she was, dressed casually, nothing extravagant, yet still managing to command my attention. She scanned the room, her gaze landing on me. "Noise might. No words." This wasn't the Ruby I remembered from the clinic, the one with the gentle eyes and friendly smile. This Ruby was all business, serious, focused. She approached the table, and I stood up awkwardly to greet her. There was no small talk, no pleasantries between us. Ruby simply sat down across from me, her hands neatly folded in front of her, her posture rigid and composed. I followed her lead, sitting down again and trying to find my voice. But it was Ruby who spoke first. "I'm not sure what we're doing anymore," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "I feel like we've crossed a line, and we need to figure out what happens next." I swallowed hard, unsure of how to respond. I had known this conversation was coming, but hearing it spoken out loud made it all feel real in a way it hadn't before. Part of me wanted to say that it didn't matter, that we could just pretend none of this had ever happened and go back to how things were before. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. Not to her. Not now. I don't know, I admitted quietly, barely above a whisper. I didn't plan for any of this to happen. Ruby sighed softly, glancing down at her hands for a moment before meeting my gaze again. Neither did I, she said, but it happened, and now we have to deal with it. There was a pause, one of those silences that stretched on too long, making the space between us feel almost suffocating. The weight of her words hung heavy in the air, and I found myself at a loss for what to say. I couldn't fathom what she wanted from me. Was she asking for an apology? An explanation? I wasn't even sure how I felt anymore. I know you're married, Ruby said suddenly, her voice cutting through the silence. I'm known from the start, and I don't want to be the reason your marriage falls apart. But I also can't just pretend that what happened between us meant nothing. The mention of my marriage hit me like a punch to the gut. Hearing it spoken out loud made everything feel even more wrong. Guilt surged within me, threatening to overwhelm me. Ruby, She held up her hand, stopping me mid-sentence. Don't, she said firmly, but not unkindly. I don't want excuses. I'm not asking you to leave your wife, and I'm not asking for some grand confession. I just need to know what you want, because I can't keep doing this. I looked down at the table, the weight of her words settling heavily on me. What did I want? I wasn't even sure anymore. Everything felt so tangled, so complicated. I couldn't deny that my feelings for Ruby had deepened, had become something more than just a passing thought over the past few weeks, no matter how much I tried to ignore them. But at the same time, I couldn't just throw away my marriage, my life, everything I had worked for. I don't know, I said finally, the words tasting bitter as they left my mouth. I don't know what I want. Ruby nodded slowly, almost as if she had anticipated that response. That's what I thought, she said softly. But you can't keep living like this. It's not fair to anyone, especially not to your wife. The mention of my wife twisted something in my gut. She had no idea what was happening, no idea how far things had gone. And here I was, torn between two lives, trying to hold on to both, and yet feeling like I was slipping away from everything. Ruby stood up, her chair scraping gently against the floor as she pushed it back. I think we both need some space to figure out what we really want, she said, her tone gentle but firm. I'm not saying this is the end, but we can't keep pretending this is normal. I nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. She was right. We couldn't keep going like this. Something had to change. I'll give you time, Ruby said, her eyes meeting mine one last time. But I need you to be honest with yourself and with me. With that, she turned and walked away, leaving me alone at the table. The cafe was silent, but the quiet felt deafening. I was left there trying to process everything. I had reached a crossroads, and no matter which path I chose, something or someone would be left behind. The days after that conversation with Ruby dragged by slowly, each one feeling heavier than the last. Everything seemed to move in slow motion. Each hour waited with indecision. I had known the conversation was coming, had expected her to ask for clarity, but I hadn't realized how much it would shake me. When I walked away from that cafe, it felt like I was standing on the edge of something huge, and yet I had no idea whether to leap or step back. At home, the atmosphere felt suffocating. My wife had known something was wrong long before I had admitted it to myself. There was an invisible barrier between us now, thickening by the day. She stopped asking questions, and I didn't push her to ask. But the silence between us spoke volumes. I could feel her eyes on me when she thought I wasn't looking, watching me with an emotion I couldn't quite name. Was it suspicion? Fear? Or maybe it was just resignation. And then there was Ruby. Her absence felt like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. We hadn't spoken since that night, and each day that passed without a word from her left me more unsettled. I kept telling myself that the space was the right thing to do, that we both needed it. But deep down, I knew I was only delaying the inevitable. One evening, after another quiet dinner, I found myself sitting on the couch, staring at the TV as my wife moved around the kitchen. The house was eerily still, and the silence between us felt unbearable. My phone buzzed on the table beside me, and I glanced down, half expecting another work email or some kind of spam message. But it wasn't another work email or some random notification. It was Ruby. We need to talk. Can you come over? My heart immediately skipped a beat. The last time we had spoken, we'd agreed to take a step back, to give ourselves space to sort through things. But now, here she was asking me to come over. I knew what that meant. Whatever had been left unsaid, whatever emotions had been simmering between us, was about to explode. I froze, my thumb hovering over the screen as my thoughts tangled. But I couldn't stop myself. I quickly typed, "I'll be there in 20 minutes, then set my phone down, trying to control the rush of emotions flooding me. I grabbed my jacket off the chair, the weight of what I was about to do settling in. My wife appeared in the doorway, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her eyes studying me. "Where are you going?" Her voice was calm, but there was something in the way she looked at me that made me feel guilty without saying a word. "I just need to clear my head," I said, avoiding her gaze. "I won't be gone long." She didn't say anything, just a small nod, her face unreadable. But I could feel her uncertainty hanging in the air, thick and heavy. The lie I just told her felt suffocating. I hated myself for it. I hated that I was lying to her, that I was walking out the door to meet someone else, someone who had been occupying my mind far too much. But the pull toward Ruby was overwhelming, and I couldn't resist it anymore. The drive to Ruby's apartment was a blur. My mind was chaotic, tangled with guilt, desire, confusion. By the time I reached her building, my hands were shaking uncontrollably. I sat in the car for a moment, trying to steady my breath, but it was no use. This was it. Whatever happened tonight, it would change everything. I walked up the stairs, my heart pounding in my chest. When I reached her door, I hesitated, my hand lingering over the doorbell, unsure if I was ready for whatever this conversation was going to bring. But before I could press it, the door swung open. And there she was, Ruby. Her face looked different, softer, more vulnerable than I had ever seen her. "Come in," she said quietly, stepping aside to let me in. I followed her inside, the silence between us almost suffocating. The tension was so thick I could practically taste it. Ruby gestured toward the couch, but I didn't sit. I couldn't. I stood there, rooted to the spot, staring at her, waiting for her to speak. She didn't sit either. Instead, she stood there, arms crossed tightly, as if she was trying to shield herself from something. "I've thought about this a lot," she began, her voice steady but with an undercurrent of emotion. "About what's been happening. About us." I swallowed, unable to find the words. My throat felt tight. "I don't know if you realize how much this has affected me," she continued, her voice breaking a little. "I didn't expect this. I didn't expect you. But now I can't stop thinking about you, and it's tearing me apart." Her words hit me like a physical blow. I saw the raw pain in her eyes, and it hurt to know I was the one causing it. But I didn't know how to make it stop, how to undo what had already happened. "Ruby, I began, but she cut me off. "I know you're married," she said, her voice rising, sharp with emotion. "I know there's someone else in your life, and I don't want to be the one to ruin that. But I can't keep pretending that what we've had, doesn't mean anything to me. It does." She paused, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "It means everything. But I need to know where I stand. Am I just a distraction for you? Or is this something more? Something real?" I inhaled deeply, trying to steady myself. The air felt thick, suffocating, as I struggled to find the right words. I had never expected this to happen, never intended for anyone to get hurt. But now, here I was caught between two worlds, and I didn't know how to navigate either of them. "Ruby, I don't know what to say," I whispered. "I never wanted this, and I never meant to hurt anyone. But the truth is, I don't even know what I feel anymore." She looked at me, eyes full of both hope and fear, like she was waiting for something that would never come. "Then tell me the truth," she said, her voice small but urgent. "Do you love me?" The question hit me hard, hanging in the air like a final verdict. I opened my mouth to answer, but no words came. I didn't know if it was love I felt for Ruby, or if it was something else, something born of the chaos in my life. But standing there, in her apartment, with her looking at me like that, I realized I didn't have the answer. The silence between us stretched on for far too long, and I saw the disappointment slowly sink into her face. She shook her head, a bitter, resigned smile playing at the edges of her lips. You don't know, do you? I shook my head, my chest tight with regret. I'm sorry. Ruby wiped at the tears beginning to fall. I can't keep doing this, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I can't keep waiting for you to figure out what you want. It's not fair. I stood there, frozen, as she turned away from me, her shoulders trembling with silent sobs. I wanted to reach out, to comfort her, but I knew it was too late. She had already made up her mind. I think you should go, she said quietly, her back still turned to me. I stood still for a moment, my heart aching, but I knew she was right. There was nothing left to say. I turned and walked to the door, each step heavier than the last. As I stepped out into the hallway, the door clicked shut behind me. For the first time in weeks, the weight of everything I had done hit me full force. I had lost both of them. Ruby, my wife. And now I was left with nothing. As I walked down the empty hallway, one question kept repeating in my mind. What if I had answered differently?